RLCS is back, man. Honestly, I don't even know what else to say for my intro, because that statement right there is the best thing I've said since the World Championship. So, yeah, that's your lead. I'm going to talk about 10 teams in depth, and I'm putting them in reverse order from 10 to 1, so you can think of this video as my power rankings too. Then at the end, I'm going to do a quick speed run through a bunch of other teams that I think are going to be relevant, giving them about 2 to 3 sentences each. This is going to be a long video, so if you only care about a couple teams, feel free to skip to their timestamp, and you can find those in the description. Alright, let's get into it. Rogue is in a pretty tough spot as a team right now, because they've been good enough to be competitive for a while, but they also haven't been quite good enough to get over the hump and become one of the region's top teams. But it's not because they haven't tried, because they've gone for multiple roster moves recently that would have put them in that top tier of North America. Last season, they tried to grab Daniel and Beast Mode before the winter split, which would have erased all their RLCS points at the time in exchange for 2 of the best players that the region has to offer. But that didn't work out. Then, this offseason, they tried to pick up Chronic, another young talent, to go alongside Aqua, and hopefully propel this team up in the standings. But again, that didn't work out. So now they're going into this season with the same squad that they ended last season with, which has to be a bit disappointing considering all the roster moves that they tried to make. But if there's a bright side for them this offseason, it's the fact that they managed to hold on to Aqua, who I think is set to prove that he is officially one of the best players in the region, even if he may not be on one of the best teams yet. He's already shown his talent last season by being the star of Rogue's offense from his very first game with them, and being one of the best scorers in the entire region, finishing 7th in goals per game and 3rd in shooting percentage. But in addition to his great goal scoring, he also made a pretty decent number of saves too, having the most on the team since he joined in the winter split. Taking a lot of shots and making a lot of saves required him to go back and forth between the goals very quickly, driving up his average speed and making him use a lot of boost in the process. And if there is one area of improvement for him in this regard, I would say that he should steal boost from the opponents more often. He was near the top of NA in boost used and collected, but he was a little farther down in boost stolen. If you're going to collect and use that much boost, then it would be helpful to take it away from the opponents as much as you can, instead of potentially taking it away from your teammates on your side of the field. Although if you're going to steal a teammate's boost, it might as well be Taroko, because I don't think he minds too much. As for the 2 vets on this team, it's pretty known that their ceiling isn't nearly as high as Aqua's, but they're still good enough to step up and make some big plays. And if we start to see them make those big plays more often, then this team's ceiling can go much higher. I'll enjoy watching Taroko be the rock that he's always been, but for this team to have any real chance of making it to the majors, they'll probably have to bring in a new player like they've been trying to for so long now. I just hope that Rogue manages to hang on to Aqua in the meantime, which I think will be much easier said than done. But regardless, I think a top 10 finish is still pretty reasonable for this team. I've already said a lot about NRG in my last 2 videos, so while I will touch on some of the things that I mentioned in them, go check them out to hear me go into much more detail about my thoughts for this team. But here, I'll say that this team is going into a make or break split, and they have a good deal of pressure riding on their performance. I know a lot of people would argue that this team was already past the make or break point, and that this team needed to make a change a while ago, but I still really don't believe that. We've seen flashes of how good their defense can be in the early parts of last season and again during the World Championship. And despite their rough patch offensively towards the end of the season, the rest of the season show that they can still do really well on offense. They still have the ability to do well on either side of the ball, but it's been a while since we've seen them do well on both sides of the ball at the same time, and there's no better time for them to start doing that than right now. Regardless of how things go for the team as a whole, I'm sure that Justin will still be the top tier player that he's been since the beginning of Season 5. Justin is really good in every area of the field, but especially shines in front of both goals, being one of the best shooters in RLCS, while also being one of the best players at quick reaction saves on the goal line. And honestly, Justin's the main reason that NRG managed to have the amount of success that they did last season. He was 2nd in the region in octane rating, 5th in goals per game, and 11th in saves. He was also their best player in general, being able to help them get a lot of wins that they wouldn't have had otherwise. For Garrett, he saw his performance step back a little bit after the great season he had in RLCSX, and I think that he was especially lacking in defense, where he didn't put enough pressure on opponents in the midfield. And in Squishy's case, he was really passive and conservative, which isn't a problem by itself necessarily, as we see in players like Nali or Torment, but for Squishy, his passive positioning was to such an extreme that he wouldn't be able to contribute to the offense's attack when they needed him to, at least not as often as you'd like. But for both Garrett and Squishy, the things that they struggled with had more to do with the decisions that they were making than it did their ability to play the game, which is actually good news for them. It's much easier to fix a player's decisions than it is to fix their abilities. But the bad news is that you have to imagine that they don't have much more time to fix all these mistakes before it's eventually too late. I'm still hopeful that they'll have a pretty good team this season. But with all the competition that they now have in North America, I don't think pretty good will be enough to take into any of the majors. But I do think it will be at least good enough for a top 8 in most events this season. And if they can get back to the peaks that they reached early in last season, then they can easily raise those expectations to put up a fight against the top teams in the region again. Now let's move on to the team that was making cross-region transfers before they became mainstream. At the beginning of last season, while they are still under the name True Neutral, this team moved up to North America and immediately became one of the better teams in the region, and surpassed even their own expectations by qualifying for the Fall Major. Things started tailing off for them after that, and they ultimately failed to qualify for the World Championship, but this team has still established a firm foundation for them to build off of this season. And that foundation starts with RLCS. He led the team in assists and saves, operating in the second man position more often than either of his teammates. He was without a doubt the best passer on this team, and this was huge for Complexity, because the other two players wouldn't control the ball all that often. In AJG's case, he had the 5th fewest goals per game out of all players in the region last season, and while his assists were slightly better, it still wasn't good enough to bring his goal participation away from the bottom of the region. So while he does have his strengths, especially on defense, he's not a player that you can expect to carry a heavy load on offense. But the other player on this team, Shad, did have a really good strength on offense, that being his shooting ability. He finished 9th in the region in goals per game and had a pretty decent shooting percentage on top of that. But the flip side of that is that if he wasn't shooting on offense, then he wasn't doing much on that end. He wouldn't possess the ball very often, and when he did, the only thing he seemed to be interested in doing was taking a shot. This shows up in his low assist total and his very far distance from the ball. With AJG and Shad having these playstyles, it meant that for Complexity to get some momentum on offense, RLCS had to be the one that started up most of the time. And while he showed that he was capable of doing that, Complexity decided to make a roster move to ease that burden on him with another cross-region transfer, replacing Shad with CRR from Spain. If you're looking for another player to take possession of the ball on offense, CRR is perfectly suited for that job. His scoring ability should be more than enough to make up for Shad's production in that area, and while his assist total may not be quite where I would have expected for a player that's on the ball as often as he is, his tendency to take the ball for himself will be enough to make RLCS's life easier. And another reason for CRR's average ball distance being so short is his near post rotations that he likes to take when he's heading back from offense to defense, doing so to try to disrupt the opponent's counterattack, similar to how Mark Baye plays defense. This isn't something that Complexity have done that much, at least not to the extent that CRR does it, so I'm curious to see how this aspect works out. I think it'll be just fine, but we'll know for sure when the season starts. Ultimately, I do think that this team will be better than last year's version, but at the same time, there's so much more competition in North America that major spots will probably be hard to come by. I'm sure that they'll be right there in contention for those major spots, and I think that they'll without a doubt be at least one of them. And I think they'll ultimately finish just outside the top 6 in the region. In what is probably the craziest cross-region transfer that the RLCS has seen to date, Gen.G has brought over 2 of the best players that England has to offer, and apparently Jack and Nolly, over to North America, to play in that region for the RLCS, alongside Chronic, who they brought in to round out the roster. Focusing on the team's 2 star players, I really like the potential fit between Nolly and Jack. I've mentioned this plenty of times on my channel before, and check out my World Championship analysis video for even more detail on this topic, but I love Nolly as a player because of his patient playstyle, in addition to his great ball skills whenever he does commit to it. This playstyle was perfect for letting some of his more ball-dominant teammates get the ball pretty much whenever they wanted, while Nolly would come in after they are done and keep the possession going. This helped to elevate his team during RLCS X when he played alongside Tho on Guild, and again during the spring split of last season when he played alongside Itachi and Astral on K-Corp. I think that this style will have similar benefits on this team as well, especially when it comes to AppJack. Jack was without a doubt one of the best players in Europe last season, and he was absolutely dominant on the offensive side of the ball. He was 3rd in EU in goals per game, and he was also 2nd in assists per game. And this offensive dominance came through a lot of ball possession and positioning the opponent's side of the field being aggressive. And even when he didn't have possession of the ball in the offensive half, he was still doing all of the little things that you need to do to put more pressure on the opponent's defense and make things easier for your teammates. This mainly being demos and boost steals in his case. So if Jack continues to play this way, I think that he and Nolly will be a perfect match together with a solid foundation for this team to build around for years to come. But that if that I threw in there is a bit bigger than you might expect. Because even though Jack played about as well as anybody could in that attacking role, I'm still not entirely sure if this is the best way to utilize his game, because I truly believe that he can fill whatever role he wants. I've had 2 experiences in professional Rocket League so far, and Jack was a part of each of them, both directly and indirectly. The first was when I worked with Kansas City Pioneers during last year's Winter Major to scout and game plan against their opponents, one of whom was Dignitas. And the other is when I applied to be the head coach for Dignitas when that spot was open, with that process involving sitting in during scrims and doing replay reviews with both the players and people within the organization. So it's fair to say that I've done quite a bit of studying on this team. And my biggest takeaway every time was that Jack had one of the most versatile skill sets in the entire region, and he had the great awareness to know exactly what he needed to do in a given moment. And I think the main reason he was so aggressive with Dignitas is because of the playstyle of his 2 former teammates. Scrub has always been a really good defensive player, and over time that has become his tendency, to the point where with Dignitas, he was always defensively positioned, never tried to do too much on the ball, and when he was on offense, he was usually just looking for one quick touch before going for a demo and then rotating back behind his teammates. so we'd see Jack spend a lot of time upfield on offense to make up for that space that was being vacated. Meanwhile, Joy has fit the mold of a slower, high-flying mechanical player while also being one of the best shooters in the world. And a player with that skill set benefits most from having a teammate who can make the defense uncomfortable with off-ball offense while he goes for solo plays, so the defense needs to worry more about the guy trying to bump them on the ground instead of the guy up in the air with the ball. And of course, a great shooter always benefits from having a great passer alongside him to give him easier shooting opportunities. So basically, Jack was doing exactly what he needed to perfectly fit alongside his two teammates. And he did that while also looking like one of the best players in the entire region in his own right. Now this isn't to say that Jack is a completely perfect player or anything, because he did make his fair share of mistakes. And there were honestly a couple times when he made more mistakes than you would expect him to. But I do think that Jack is one of the few players in the world that has all the tools to be whatever you need him to be, and that alone will be a huge boost for this team. But as much as people are going to be watching Jack and Nolly, the player that I'm most intrigued by going into the season is Chronic. Most people, myself included, would expect a team making a cross-region transfer as big as this one to go and get an established big-name teammate to play alongside them. But instead, they went with the talented and pretty unproven Chronic. From the outside looking in, this move can seem like a bit of a wild card, but I'm pretty excited about it. Despite his young age, Chronic has a decent amount of RLCS experience under his belt, with his first main event coming in RLCS X Fall Regional 3, which was around 2 years ago now. He also made 2 main event appearances last season, one in Winter Regional 3 and the other in Spring Regional 3. And honestly, the biggest takeaways from last season is that he spent a lot of time in defense and made a lot of saves, but that's not saying much. Because with how much pressure the opponents were putting on him and his teammates, everybody on this team was playing a lot of defense, and they all made a lot of saves. But between his performances in various 1v1 matches and minor tournaments around the scene, it's obvious that the talent is there. And the fact that Jack and Nolly picked him to be their third, despite all the players that they could have gone for, shows that they're really confident in what he can do. So all in all, with all of the various factors going into this team, it's kind of hard to give a solid prediction, but I think that they'll at least be in contention for a spot at each of the majors. And I think that they'll get better and better as the season goes on, as they get more comfortable with each other, and with the new opponents that they're facing more often than they ever have before. After last season, Beast Mode has firmly established himself as one of the best players in North America, but if I'm being honest, I still think he's being underrated by a lot of people in the community. I see a lot of talk about how good of a striker Beast Mode is, and he absolutely is, so no complaints there. But I think that kinda undersells him, because he does so much work all over the field that just referring to him as a good striker doesn't really do him justice. And describing his overall impact is kinda hard to do, because the core stats don't really flatter him all that much, outside of his scoring. He gets plenty of assists, but not really enough to back up any potential claim to call him one of the best passers. And the number of saves that he gets doesn't really lead you to think that he's one of the best defenders either. But whenever I watch V1 play, it just seems like Beast Mode is everywhere, and that's because he basically is. And with the way that this team likes to play, he has to be. Com is, of course, one of the most aggressive players in the entire world when he's away from the ball on offense, especially when he's looking for demos. Spacestation might have been the most demo-heavy team last season, but Com was without a doubt the most demo-heavy player, being first in NA in demos per game. He also led the region in time spent as the player farthest forward on the field, and most of the time when he was up there, he was trying to disrupt the other team with those demos or boost steals to try to clear a path for Beast Mode and make his job even easier. And Com does have plenty of ball skills himself. Somebody on the Rocket League esports subreddit brought up his 1v1 show match debut on Johnny Boy's channel and referred to him as a mechanical goblin, which feels oddly appropriate, and I like it. But despite being a goblin, if there's a scenario where either Com or Beast Mode can take the ball, Beast Mode's probably going to take it every time, while Com goes out ahead to clear the way for him. Torment, on the other hand, was pretty much the exact opposite of Com in just about every way. Torment is of course legendary for his defense, as he's been one of the best defenders in the world even going back to the Cloud9 days, and that hasn't changed at all in his time with V1. You'll most often see Torment sitting behind his teammates in nearly every scenario and playing defense all over the field. Whether you need him to stop a counterattack in the midfield, or to shadow an opponent who's dribbling, or to make a clutch save at the last possible moment, you can count on Torment to get it done every time. So with Beast Mode's teammates playing like this, they spend a lot of time away from the ball, which means that Beast Mode is very often the only person that's able to provide ball pressure for his team. But he does it very well by constantly speeding all over the field and making sure he's pretty much always close enough to make a play on the ball when he needs to. And he never seems overwhelmed by this huge responsibility that he's always given, because he comes through for this team time and time again, especially when they're on LAN. So for my prediction, I'll guess that they finish in the top 6 in NA, and Beast Mode ends the season as the North American MVP. Overall, Spacestation had a pretty good season last year, despite some of the hiccups they ran into. They finished the fall split in a tie for 5th place, losing in the tiebreaker to Complexity to miss out on the fall major. Then after bringing in Daniel to replace Typical, the team saw some improvement. qualifying for the winter and spring majors, and finishing in the top 3 and top 6 in those lands respectively. But then, after a middling top 12 performance at the World Championship, they made a switch from Retals to LJ. And for as ugly as the roster move may have been in terms of how it was handled, it's hard to not like this move from a gameplay perspective. Even though he may not have the team results to back up this claim yet, I think that LJ is one of the best players in the entire region. That Oxygen roster has been wavering between average and very good for about the past 2 years, with their apex coming in the winter split where they finished 6th in the region after the regionals, 1 spot away from major qualification, and 1 spot behind Spacestation, coincidentally. LJ had been the main offensive force for this Oxygen team ever since they came together under the name Gen.G, and he was a huge reason for the success that this team was able to achieve. He had always been a really good passer, but last season, he officially rounded into being one of the best passers in the region, finishing 4th in assists per game in North America. LJ will bring a new dynamic to Spacestation by being, in my opinion, the best passer that this team has ever seen, and that includes Typical. And he'll also bring a new dynamic by being more ball dominant than any other SSG player has been before, which makes sense for him because to be a good passer you generally have to have the ball a lot. But this is the aspect that I'm most curious about when it comes to Spacestation's potential success this coming season. As I'm sure most of you know, Spacestation has always been known for their demos and physicality, and a lot of the scoring chances that they'd create would come as a direct result of this playstyle, which both Retals and Arsenal heavily contributed to. LJ isn't nearly as physical as Retals, but of course not many people are, so the main question is how exactly will the team as a whole adjust to this reduced aggression? With his teammates clearing opponents out of the way so often, Daniel would have plenty of space to show off his mechanics by taking solo plays through the air from the defensive half. But now, with only one teammate looking for bumps that often, the amount of opportunities that he'll get in this scenario will probably be a bit smaller. And if I had to guess, I'd say that the solo play opportunities that he loses will be made up by the passes that he receives from LJ that put him in an even better scoring chance than he'd have if he tried to create the opportunity by himself. And if there is a downside to this, which probably won't matter at all, but just in case, it's that in order for Daniel to receive LJ's passes, he'll need to be farther up the field when those passes are made in order for him to be close enough to actually take a shot off of them. So that means that Daniel, the team's best defender and most passive player in terms of positioning, will be upfield more often than he ever has before, which could put the team in some shaky situations on defense if those passes to Daniel don't end up connecting, especially if Arsenal is caught up in front of the play going for his bumps. This probably won't even be an issue for this team, but if it is, I still think that the offensive upgrade that they get from bringing in LJ will still be enough to offset any potential downside. So overall, I think that Spacestation will be at least as good as they were last year, make it to at least 2 of the majors, and finish the season in the top 6 of North America. There are a lot of teams that I'm really excited to watch this season, but Optic is probably the one that I'm looking forward to the most. Every player on this team is already really talented in their own right, and based off that talent alone, I think they're already in a really good spot to be one of the top teams in the region. But the more that I look at all of the players' individual strengths and how well they fit together, I start to like this team more and more. First of all, you have AJ, who I think is the star of this team and will be the guy that the offense runs through most of the time. Last season on Faze, he was a key part of helping that team be one of the best offenses in the world, even before they brought in Typical before the winter split. AJ had the 3rd most goals per game in the region last season, and the 5th most assists, but despite having the 5th most assists, he was still last on his own team in that stat, which shows how insanely good Faze's offense was last season. But I'm getting off track, we'll talk about them later. The point is that AJ is really good offensively, and I think that AJ's greatest weapon is the ability to slow the ball down wherever he wants and start a threatening air dribble from anywhere on the field. This was especially true for him in RLCS when he was the focal point of his team's offense. He would spend a lot of time up in the air and would slow down very often, most of the time for the purpose of him getting that first touch to set up an air dribble. And while he wasn't as reliant on those same slow-moving air dribbles this season on Faze, they were still a part of his bag of tricks. And now that he's likely to be the lead of a team's offense again this season with Optic, I'm willing to bet that we see him go back to his bread and butter more often. And if somebody likes to go for plays like this, then they're going to need a lot of space to pull it off consistently. And there aren't many players who are better at clearing that space than Retals. He was one of the 2 players, alongside Arsenal, who was the reason why Spacestation had the demo-heavy playstyle that they did last season. But on top of that, Retals was near the top of the region in a bunch of stats that correlate to offensive aggression and disruption, including being 4th in North America in demos per game, 6th in boost stolen, and 4th in time spent in the offensive third. When AJ goes up in the air for his solo plays, the opponents are going to want to get in his face and challenge him before he gets going. But it's going to be a lot harder for teams to get in AJ's face if they have to worry about Retals getting in their face. And that fact alone is going to give AJ a lot more chances to make a play on the ball. Not to mention that Retals is pretty good on the ball too. It's not like he's a one-trick pony on offense who can only bump people out of the way. He can make some stuff happen. But for as much as I love the fit between AJ and Retals, if there is one downside, is that I don't think either one of them are particularly strong defenders. Not to say that they're outright bad at defense or anything, but if they get caught in a bad situation on that end, they might be less likely to get the ball away from their own net safely than some of the other stronger defenders in the region. As I'm sure some of you know, these two have actually been on the same team before, back in Season 9 when they played for the Pittsburgh Knights alongside Gyro. And while they had a few issues in their time together, I think the biggest one was their inconsistency on the defensive end, which would see them get stuck on that side of the field for a lot longer than they'd want to be, meaning that they couldn't break out of their own half and play offense where this team was really going to be able to shine. And because of that, this made the team look very average all around the field, despite their offensive talent. But this quote-unquote weakness on the defensive end is exactly where Magic Bear comes in. AJ and Reddles may not be players that you want stuck on the defensive side of the field for too long, but Magic Bear's time with Torrent has him well prepared for that scenario. Torrent as a whole played one of the most defensive and counter-attack heavy styles that I had ever seen last season, spending more time in the defensive third as a team per 5 minutes than anybody else in the region by a wide margin. And Magic Bear led the charge in this area as he spent more time in that part of the field than either of his teammates, even though all of them were in the top 6 in that stat. Magic Bear was also 7th in the region in saves per game, and was a key part of starting Torrent's counterattacks by making a great touch on the ball when he made the save to help his team break out of defense and get the counterattack started. And his ability to do that so well will be able to get AJ and Reddles back on the offensive side of the field where they can do their damage again. But defense isn't the only thing that Magic Bear is good at. He's shown some really flashy mechanics throughout his entire RLCS career, and he has pretty good scoring ability himself too. And I think that we'll see him reach a new level on that side of the field alongside his two new teammates. So I have this team solidly in my next tier of teams underneath the top 3 of Furia, Faze, and G2, and I think that they'll make it to a couple majors and win at least one regional on their way to qualifying for the World Championship. I know that I said that Gen.G did the craziest cross-region transfer, but I wouldn't blame you if you thought that Furia's move was even crazier. Sure, they're basically doing the same thing that True Neutral did after RLCS, but with Furia dominating international competitions in addition to dominating their own region, they're poised to make an even bigger initial splash on the NA scene than True Neutral did. They come into the season with a solid argument for already being the best team in the region, and an even stronger argument for having the best player in the region, with the South American MVP Yan moving north to play on the NA servers. After the Winter Major, I talked about Yan and how good his passing was. Then after the Spring Major, I talked about how good his shooting was. And any player that can go from being one of the best passers to one of the best shooters in a moment's notice is more than worthy of being called one of the best players. He's a mechanical monster who does whatever he wants in the air, while spending a whole lot of time up there, and I'm excited to see that trend continue against tougher competition in North America. You guys want to hear a crazy stat though? Yen had the 3rd highest goals per game in South America, if you only account for the regionals, and he was also 3rd in goals on his own team, meaning that Furia occupied all 3 spots in the top 3 of goals per game, which gives you a peek at how dominant they were in their region. First in the stat for the team was Card, which was honestly a pretty big shock to me because I'd always thought of him as the least offensive player on the team. At least I thought that when I watched them during the majors, because I have to admit that while I did catch some of the South American regionals, I never studied them too closely. But the impression that I did get from him during the majors was that he's the team's best defender, especially when it came to defending in the midfield and making sure opponents didn't have easy looks as they moved into Furia's half. His scoring output at LANs wasn't close to his scoring output during the regionals, and I would expect his goal scoring this season to be closer to what he produced in the LANs. But he should still be really solid in that area regardless. Then you have Kaio, who was 2nd on the team in goals per game, and he was also 1st in assists in South America. And while he definitely is a great passer, I think that his biggest strength comes from his shooting accuracy, as he had one of the best shooting percentages at the LANs out of all the players to play in one. He's great at making strong and accurate first touches to get the ball exactly to where it needs to go, whether that's to a teammate, or more often, to the top corner of the goal. So for my prediction for this team, I think that they'll solidly be in the top 3 of the region by the season's end, and they should also give the other top teams a run for their money in the race for the #1 spot, even if they don't ultimately reach that goal. I think that they'll make it to all 3 majors, but at the very least, I would consider it a massive upset if they didn't make it to at least 2 of them. Also, I'm just going to go ahead and congratulate the future 2023 South American champion, whoever that may be, for their move to North America after the season, since that's just how that works now, I guess. I'm going to spend a lot of this section complaining, so just bear with me for a little bit. When Faze added Typical at the beginning of the winter split last season, I went on record in a video saying that they were going to be the best team in North America by a wide margin. And I was so certain of that. Like, there aren't many predictions that I made that I believed in more than that one. They had First Killer, who's an all-around terror on the field, while being my pick for the region's best player at the time. And he still has a pretty good claim for that spot, give or take a Yan or Atomic. And they also had AJ, who's one of the best offensive aerial threats, and a player who's good enough on offense to essentially carry a team on that side of the ball, which he kinda did during RLCS when he was playing alongside Gyro and Illusion. And for Typical, during his time at Spacestation, he was one of the best individual defenders in the entire world, and was a huge reason for SSG having the great defense that they did. and he also showcased some really good skills on the ball whenever he was given the chance. So with First Killer and AJ leading the attack, I thought that Typical would slide in as the player who would single-handedly fix all of their defensive problems, while also being yet another threat that opponents had to watch for when Faze had the ball. And I was very wrong about that, because that's not what happened. Typical went from being a really defensive and conservative player on Spacestation to being just as aggressive as everybody else on his new team. When he joined Faze, he saw a huge decrease in his number of saves, his amount of time spent in the defensive third, and as farthest back on the field. Meanwhile, he saw increases in goals and assists, time in the offensive third, and boost stolen. And the craziest thing about this playstyle change is that it still worked really well for him. He finished the season 2nd in assists per game, behind only First Killer, and he was 6th in goals per game, with both of his teammates coincidentally being in front of him. So if the two strengths that Typical showed on Spacestation were his defense and his great ball skills and limited opportunities, then the move to Faze allowed him to show that if you increase his opportunities on the ball, it wouldn't affect his efficiency at all. So Typical is now solidly one of the best offensive players in the region. But the problem for Faze was that's not what they needed from Typical if the team was going to improve. Even when they had Illusion, Faze's offense was already really good. In fact, you could have argued at that time that it was already the best offense in North America. But on the other hand, their defense was kind of lagging behind, and that was the thing that was keeping them from being the best team in North America. So when Typical came in and started dominating offensively, it was really cool, because they went from arguably being the best offense in North America to being the best offense in the entire world. But while their offense was getting even better, their defense was falling behind even more. Illusion was the biggest part of keeping their defense together with his midfield challenges, playing shadow defense to give time for his teammates to rotate back to make saves, and just generally doing the dirty work that you need to do as a defense to disrupt the other team's offense. And he would often sacrifice his involvement on offense to make those plays. But now with him gone, and all three players trying to contribute to Faze's offensive push, their great offense became a double-edged sword at times, because if they didn't score, then there would be plenty of easy counterattacking chances for their opponents. So instead of Typical shoring up Faze's weaknesses on the defensive side and making them a more well-rounded team like I thought he was going to, he instead enhanced their strength and made their weaknesses even weaker. But now, Faze have replaced AJ with Mist, who is another player who is a great defender, especially on the goal line, and is able to make great plays on the ball despite not needing to possess it himself so much. And in Mist's case, that shows up through his great shooting. Last season he played alongside Atomic in the fall and Drees in the rest of the season, and those were the two players who would have possession of the ball most often, while Mist would look to capitalize off their passes to take shots and score goals. So, look, I know it's basically the same thing that I said when Typical joined, because like Typical, Mist's skill set that he's shown to this point is exactly what Faze needs to shore up their weaknesses. And I got burned by that prediction last time, so I'm trying not to get my hopes up too high, but also a wise man once said,
"There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, 'Fool me once, shame on you.' If fool me, we can't get fooled again."
But at the same time, I see the vision for this team, and if it comes together in the way that I know it can, then they will be the best team in the region. Better than G2, better than Furia, all of them. They already have the best offense in the region, so if Mist is the player that's going to help them shore up their defense in the way that I thought Typical was going to, then they'll be just about unstoppable. So you know what? I'm ready for them to break my heart again, and I'm going to predict that by the season's end, Faze will be the #1 team in North America in the standings. And I can't wait for that prediction to bite me in the butt again. But while I do think that Faze will eventually sit on North America's throne, there's only one team right now that deserves to take the top spot in this season preview, and they're not going to let that spot go easily. I've talked a lot about G2 recently, giving them sections in my videos following the Winter Major and the World Championship. And in those sections, I spent a lot of time talking about Atomic because he's basically impossible to not talk about. Best passer in the region, unparalleled creativity, all that good stuff. But check out those videos if you want to hear me say more about him. Then on this team, you also have Chicago, who is the agent of chaos for this team, and is more or less the single reason why G2 became known for their speed and aggression. He's able to set the tone for his offense's attack and put the defense in uncomfortable spots all at once. On its own, that would be enough to make him a very threatening player, but when that's combined with his great shooting ability, which just puts even more pressure on opponents, it makes him one of the best players in the region, and quite literally the spearhead of G2's offense. But Atomic and Chicago already get enough love. At the very least, they've gotten enough from me. And with two players that flashy on the same team, JNAPS almost becomes an afterthought when thinking about what makes this team so good. But it can't be denied that without JNAPS, this team probably wouldn't be able to function nearly as well. He's always been the team's most defensive player, and I say that with air quotes because he still isn't all that defensive. But the thing that sets JNAPS apart from his teammates is the fact that he's often in the farthest one back on the field, while Atomic and Chicago are creating havoc for the other team on offense. When G2 sets up in the opponent's half, and they're trying to build the pressure, One of the most important parts of sustaining that pressure is being able to keep the ball in that half when the opponents try to clear. And that's exactly what JNAP's job is a lot of the time. He'll set up at midfield when G2 moves up in the offense, and when a defender tries to clear, JNAP's is right there in the perfect spot to send it right back and then join into the offensive rotation and keep the play going. But even with JNAP's filling this role for G2 more often than his teammates, he's still extremely good on offense himself. During RLCS X, JNAP's was 3rd in goals per game and 2nd in assists per game out of all players in North America, being neck and neck with Chicago on both of those stats. Now during that season, they played 2 of the splits with Rizzo, who admittedly didn't have the same impact on the score sheet as his teammates, which meant that Chicago and JNAP's were responsible for finishing a lot of G2's possessions. But with Atomic joining the team for the last 2 splits of last season, he of course would be taking possession of the ball himself much more often. That meant that JNAP's took a bit of a hit on the stat sheet, but that same all-around offensive ability was still there. If there was a pass that needed to be made, he would put it on a dime. And if there was a shot that he needed to take, he would place it perfectly. There aren't many more well-rounded players in the entire world than JNAP's, and that adaptability allows him to perfectly support his teammates no matter what's going on around them. There was a rumor floating around last season that if G2 won the World Championship, then JNAP's would have retired. I'm not sure how true that rumor is, and I definitely don't want to say that I'm glad that they lost just so that we get to keep watching them play. But, yeah, you feel me. For a prediction, I already picked Faze Clan to be first in NA, but of course G2 is right there in the race for that spot, alongside Furia. So my prediction is at least top 3 in NA at the end of the season, qualification for all 3 majors, and a few funny tweets from their social media team whenever they lose in grand finals this season. Because, you know it's coming. Alright, time for the lightning round. And I'm gonna go unscripted for this because I honestly don't feel like writing anything else down. For Dignitas, I'm really excited about Dries because I thought he made huge improvements as the year went on, showing off a lot of speed and really good passing ability. I think that he'll be the star of this team, but I think Andy and Delta are going to do pretty good too, especially since they already have some chemistry from playing together on the Charlotte Phoenix alongside Beastabonium. Wait, is it Beastabonium or Beastabonium? Well, whatever, he's not even on this team. Andy will most likely be up on offense with Dries a lot of the time, while Delta's back to support him. This team could do some damage. Then we have Team Axel, who on top of doing a 10 out of 10 job on their rebrand, also signed a pretty good roster. LJ may have gotten most of the love for last year's Oxygen team, and he honestly deserved it, but the revival of Gimmick's shooting ability after he joined this team honestly went understated. Toasty is also really good, and I'm looking forward to seeing him step up and take more opportunities on the ball. And then you have Ajax, who was a part of the E-United experiment that I honestly don't want to talk about. But through all the roster changes that they made over the years, he stuck with them the whole time, which says a lot about their confidence in him as a player. Being on a good team again will probably breathe new life into his career, and because of that, this team could do some damage. Now that Shopify Rebellion added 2-piece to go alongside Parth, they have 2 really young, really mechanical players who are probably going to make a lot of noise on offense. And because of that, I think it's going to be up to Memory to make sure that things don't go wrong behind them whenever they go for mechanical play that doesn't work out. He's used to making a lot of saves though, so I think he'll be up to the task. Out of all the teams in this lightning round, I think that they have the highest ceiling. And because of that, this team... Nah, I'm not saying it again. It stops being funny after a while. I think the Pittsburgh Knights have a lot of reason to be optimistic about this season. Sosa used to be thought of as one of the most exciting up-and-coming players in the region, but he hasn't quite gotten the results that people expected him to. He's always had this sort of Nolly-like playstyle, where he's really far from the ball but he's really efficient with it once he gets it, and this could very well be the year that we see that style play out in RLCS main events more often than qualifiers. They also have the Nintendo Switch legend Cheese, and the consistent veteran Zombie Poop Shark. But there's one more important thing that I have to say. Sosa, if you watch this video, please unban me on Twitch. He's the only person I've been banned from, and I'm kinda salty about it, so let's be friends. The thing I'll be watching most in Luminosity is how Lineblaze bounces back after last season. He had a pretty unceremonious split from Ghost Gaming, after that season kinda fell off of them for a lot of off-the-field reasons. But Lineblaze is still extremely talented, so I hope that this new team environment will get him back to the top form that he should be in. If he does, this team's gonna be pretty good. But also, there's of course no stats for that, and I wanted to have a stat for every team in this lightning round, so I'm just gonna say that they all made a lot of saves. Don't really think that'll be too relevant this year, but you know, just a little fun fact for you. Dark Zero is going to be a really interesting team to watch this season, and how Zanil decides to play is going to heavily influence this team's playstyle. Turbo and J-Pow are both pretty slow and methodical players, with J-Pow being slower on the ball more often, and Turbo being slower because he's most often holding down the middle of the field while he's waiting for a shooting chance. With 2 different players who play oh my gosh, tongue twister. Let me try that again. With 2 different players who play patiently like this, that means that they're going to need somebody to speed things up sometimes. And most of the time, that guy's probably going to have to be Zanil. Even though they missed the first regional, I think that we'll see them in main events pretty consistently throughout the season. And last but not least, well actually now that I think about it, if I ranked all these teams in the lightning round, this team probably would be last. so I guess they technically are least. But regardless, we have Ghost Gaming, who could be pretty good this season still, but I think that they'll have a pretty hard time replacing Lion Blaze. This team was at their best last season when Shock and Lion Blaze were working together on offense, while Hotzer was supporting him from far away in a defensive position. But now that they brought in T-Corel, they have another player who's pretty defensive. I'm sure they won't leave Shock out there by himself on offense, but I'm curious to see how this offense gets around those tendencies to create the offensive form that they need. Alright, video's over. Join my Discord, follow me on Twitter, and links to both of those things can be found in the description. I'll be back sometime next week for part 2 of the season preview when we talk about Europe. And of course, thanks for watching.